first and foremost, I want to say, Les, welcome, but also just a deep appreciation for taking the time to connect. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Terrific. I'm all set.
All right, and today we're discussing your book, Becoming Whole: Jung's Equation for Realizing God. But before we get into that book specifically, we generally start with a question of how you initially came to have an interest in, maybe in this situation, Jungian psychology.
Yeah. Well, my original profession was as a lawyer, and I was became a professor of law. I was at the University of Toronto. This is in the early '80s, and decided to take a sabbatical and went to Australia, where I am now, and because of some difficulties I was having, I went to see a therapist who was a Jungian analyst, but not just another therapist, but rather one of Carl Jung's original students.
Hmm.
And I worked with her to deal with my own issues at the time, and then began to train with her and went to other institutes to fill in some academic courses. And there was something in that, what Jung was expressing, that really had a sort of, even though he denied being a mystic, but had a mystical tone to me. And it coincided with a trip that I took on behalf of the United Nations to India. And in that trip, I was sent to work because my area of expertise was to do with urban planning law. I was sent to Varanasi, India, where I got my first taste that there was something other than what I had thought existed as a lawyer and as being brought up in the Bronx in New York. And it just seemed to actually address that in a way which it seemed to address that quality that was in India, of sort of a mystery that was needed to be unfolded. And after I did that training, I became a Jungian analyst, a psychoanalyst, but didn't immediately practice that because I had a lot more to be done in terms of trying to help out deprived groups, to become a sort of environmental lawyer and so on. And I returned to it again eventually in the 90s to make it my full-time life and to leave the other behind. Even though I still keep an interest in the effect of cities on mental health. So my interest in Jung has been for a long, long time. And what happened with that book was that the person I was seeing, a woman called Rix Weaver, would always say to me that Ibn Arabi, who was a Sufi, spoke the same language as Jung, but in different words. I had no idea what she was talking about. She often would say, "I can't see you next week. I'm going on a week-long retreat," although she didn't leave her home because she was disabled at the time. Nevertheless, she'd be calling people in Turkey, and I don't know what she was doing. She never told me. And then I came across this formula of Jung's, and that led me to look at it from both sides. But my interest in Jung has been, I guess, 40 years I've had that interest.
Hmm. Going to that particular Jungian analyst back then, was that just good fortune, or how do you make sense of that?
Well, I didn't know what that was at the time, so
Mm.
I always look at these things as something moving us in the right direction. I don't look at things as just coincidence. So I felt at the time, well, that's what I needed to begin to approach the idea that there was something more to me than just my intellectual mind. And the way to do that was to go to someone who was the kind of person who was deeply connected with their own spirit.
Mm.
And so I don't know. I couldn't begin to say what did it, but I've always looked at it as the miracle that it was, and in a sense, not really of my doing. I was just sort of sent there.
Mm. I'm always curious, and generally we start with this similar question, and maybe it's around the search part of this In Search of Wisdom, and then we wrap up with this what is wisdom question. But how do you make sense of this search for wisdom? Like, to give you a bit of context, and also for the listeners of
Sure.
many guests on the show that maybe have spent, decades on silent retreat and all sorts of stuff, and like yourself, 4 decades now of this interest in Jung, and it's still going. Maybe it's evolved and changed over time, but how do you make sense of maybe a particular moment or series of moments that sends someone on some sort of search, if you will?
Well, in all, almost in every religion, there's this idea that there's a guide. The Holy Spirit is an example of that. In Hinduism, there's the Atma. There's the idea that something is working through us. Ralph Waldo Emerson called it the Oversoul. Borges, the writer, called it the Allah. Something within us which actually is seeking itself. And so much of the search actually is mental in a way. We're always sort of dissatisfied, looking for more, hoping we'll get somewhere. But the search is, the only way I approach it is that the search is not my search, it's a research of consciousness trying to refine itself. And therefore, it's driving everybody along the way. There's not a person, even you look at the bad example, but I often use it, the coronavirus. I mean, it kept on improving and improving and improving. Well, what made it improve? You could say evolution, but then you say, well, what's behind that? So I feel that the search is part of the attempt by that sort of higher aspect of ourselves to keep on refining ourselves and itself for the purpose of bringing greater consciousness. Now, if in fact it was just me who was saying this, and, you'd say, nice theory, Les, but as I said, this is the whole notion of the Holy Spirit, that there's something there which actually is a guide, or people often refer to in therapy that there was like there could have been their great grandfather appeared to them in a dream, or there was something that had a hand on their shoulder. It's the idea that we're all being led somewhere. So I know it's not a simple answer, but I take that search as a search that it's like being on a train. I got on it, and now it's taking me wherever it needs to go. I'm not the one who's actually guiding this search. But I feel everybody, even people who deny it, or who are materialists, or who are scientists, at some point or other come across a kind of miracle. I work with a lot of people as they're dying, and sometimes people say, well, geez, I feel a bit different now, as if there's something in me that's sort of really trying to help me along with this period of my life. So I think everybody at every point at some point in their existence will actually feel that they're being guided. And to me, that's proof enough. Plus, I hear dreams all the time, and I'm just totally amazed at their mystery and how they come about. So I think everybody's on a search. Some people, for developmental reasons, can't actually have other things to deal with, complex trauma, depression, But even they are sort of searching to get out of it. And in that search, that's their way of refining themselves. So I think it's universal. However, I'll just tell you a quick story. I went to what was called the Kumbh Mela in India, 2001. It was 50 million people in India. And at the end, I was standing there dipping in the water between the two rivers that came together, soaking wet and taking the holy dip. And a naked monk came up to me and grabbed me by the shoulders. And he said to me, "It's time to call off the search." And I think what he meant by that is it's not a mental process. It's not a sort of something to be obtained. It's not something I can, put on my wall as a trophy. That's the search that has to be called off. And it has to be instead moved to that aspect in you, which is just taking you along the way. So you don't mentally have to search. It'll take you.
That's so interesting. I really appreciate the background, Les, in that story. I'm not sure if this is a fair question, but I'm curious to ask while we're on this idea of Jungian analysis. How do you think that might be different from, say, traditional therapy? And maybe traditional is not the right word, but other modes of therapy. You think there's so many different types.
Sure.
Is there anything that comes to mind around that?
Yeah, of course. A lot of the forms of therapy are to deal with pathology, sort of treatment for PTSD, intervention in a marriage which is falling apart, attempts to cure depression. I think the Jungian enterprise is really meant to ask a bigger question, which is, who are you actually really? What's going on? What's behind what you think is going on? What's there which makes you the person that you are? So therefore, Jung's reliance on what he called the unconscious, which means those things which are within you, which you don't know. And often that comes through with dreams or projections or fantasies or stories which a person will bring. So, for instance, if somebody has a dream about a man who's in a room with them, but the man's lying on the ground and can't get up, well, we treat that as, where did that come from, except from their own hidden material, to indicate to them, look, there's an aspect of you which is that. There it is. There's an aspect of you which is sleeping, doesn't want to face the world. So that's what the analysis is about. Sure, people who are psychologists and Jungian analysts often orient themselves to fixing the pathology, especially, but the Jungian enterprise is that the pathology will be absorbed as you go and find out more about who you are, what your ancestors have talked to you about, that are coming through. Why do you actually have this low opinion of yourself? Maybe your parents didn't necessarily give it to you, but that's part of your whole ancestral story that's there. The family karma that's carried out. So the idea of Jungian analysis is depth psychology, to go deeper and deeper into those aspects of what's hidden, the darker aspects, what Jung called the shadow, to start bringing those out and then getting different levels of peace that come from expanding your that ego part of yourself, and beginning to see that there's something else called the self, which is exactly what that book was about. The self being a central point within us, which it's been already found by neurobiologists that we have such a thing in the brainstem, attempt at homeostasis, at balance, at centering. And that part's constantly working to actually bring things to it so you can begin to realize that it's operating within. But there's something, imagine what it'd be like if you actually didn't have to worry so much about all the things you're worrying about, but rather that was actually carrying you along, taking you somewhere. So the realization of that self is really what Jung was on about, in order to find a balance point between all the conflicting things that you have. So it's a different process. It could be the same, because as somebody comes and they're depressed, of course, you're working with that, but you don't work with it in terms of, try and breathe this way or try and do that, but rather let's go deeply into the sources of all that, the family story, what the unconscious is saying in dreams, what your projections are towards other people, why you dislike that person for a reason you don't know, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I see it.
Yeah. Well, beautiful. And we typically start by maybe defining or unpacking a few terms. And there's a number of them. You mentioned a couple already, but I have a few notes here, and maybe we could spend this first portion talking about a few. And the first one is individuation. How would you introduce that particular term to the listeners?
Well, if you think of the moment that all of us are basically coming out of a kind of small s self, a kind of conglomeration of thoughts and memories, that's what we see who we are. But the process of individuation is to begin to assay what's not visible in that spectrum and begin to look at all these things at the depth level. So we begin to see the weakness that we are, the sort of brutality that we might have. And the more that happens, the more we become an individual. So individuation is sort of a greater awareness of all aspects of ourselves.
Mm.
Because once they come forward and they're accepted as part of us, they lose a bit of their sting. These, what Jung called complexes, these sort of emotional balls of sort of issues that we have, of father complex, of mother complex, things about failure of parents to live up to some ideal. All of that begins to get worked out, and therefore our own individuality expanded. So individuation is, I think, making more of who we are as an individual, becoming fully an individual, individuated.
Mm. And let me read something that you write here. It says the self becomes, through the individuation process, the point of reference that permits the material of the ego to be understood. The search for the self is therefore a significant aspect of the individuation process, which you've touched on. Maybe could you say more there and talk a
Sure.
little bit about the ego and what does that mean, and maybe the shadow as well, if you can.
Sure. Well, we all need an ego. I mean, we need some strength of an ego in order to sort of deal with some of the darkness and aspects of ourselves. But the idea is that this notion of a self is really meant to indicate that, similar to the God within, the Atman, or the Holy Ghost, and so on, the Ruach, Kabbalah, all of these things, this force is in us. And when we give over to that, when we begin to accept that that exists, and we can see it play out in our lives, then what happens is we become less of an ego and more of a whole person. We begin to see other aspects of ourselves. We begin to accept shadow aspects of ourselves. I remember first shadow aspect that I was my analyst. There was a figure in the dream that was sort of sneaking around in the background. And she said, well, that's you. I go, oh, no, that's not me. I'm not sneaky and all that. But of course it is. We all have that quality. And seeing the shadow and beginning to understand leads us to also see that there's something working there, bringing this stuff up for us, exposing new things. When we think we've sort of worked things out in our head, well, we haven't really. There's more to actually see. And it's the self, which is like a magnet, as Jung expresses it, drawing things to itself to help us understand the totality of what we're dealing with. Now, of course, a lot of these words and phrases that I'm using are part of the language of Jungian psychoanalysis. But in plain terms, trying to avoid that kind of language, what we're seeking to do is to just accept ourselves, accept all aspects of ourselves. And as we do, we also have to accept that there's something that's a mystery in us, which we don't actually understand, which finds us in a situation where we didn't expect to be, presents opportunities and takes away opportunities, and creates chaos, but also joy. We begin to see that. We see the action of the self. And when you accept that, if you think just for a moment what it would be like, then the most you can do it when situations arise is just have a laugh. Okay, now what am I supposed to do? This is the next thing. Thanks for that one. Okay, oh, now I won this award. Okay, well, that's pumping up my ego a bit. Okay, oh, now I see what's going on. Yeah, thank you for that lesson. And so on.
I made a couple notes and of everything reading, and I'm kind of thinking about previous conversations on the podcast and more. I'm thinking more about maturity, this thing of becoming mature, and that connecting with wisdom. And it seems to me, as hearing you talk and reading through your book, which I really found fascinating, such an interesting read, that this thing of becoming mature, and words like letting go or acceptance or surrender, there's so many of these synonyms that come up across wisdom traditions. What comes up for you around, just maturing as a human?
Well, I feel that the mystery that I'm calling it is very serious, because it's a profound space that goes beyond our sort of thoughts. Sometimes when you walk in a church, you'll feel the solemnity of the whole thing. The fact that it's not sort of light and fun as much as it has a sort of solemn nature in the God of that church. I've come across it in Sufi shrines. I've come across it sort of other kinds of holy places. So therefore, there has to be a beginning to actually accept that it's serious. It's not boring and not sort of like a serious old priest who's sort of retiring and bored with the whole thing. It's serious in the sense that it's a reality beyond our understanding, and we have to respect it. And the surrender comes only by giving consent to wanting to go deeper and explore more. At any point, you can get off the train, the next stop before it reaches its destination, using that analogy. My view is that if you continuously just say, okay, I accept that. I understand that that's an aspect of me. And as to the mystery, I have great respect for it. It's solemn. It's real. And it's, who knows what it is. I mean, you could call it God, or you could call it sort of by any name, but evolution, you could say it is. Or you could say God's will, or, the Atman aspect of the Brahman contained in your heart, or you could say it's one of the layers of soul, or whatever, but it doesn't matter what you call it, because in some traditions you can't even utter the name of God. It's way beyond you. So therefore, I think maturity comes when you begin to see that it's not that it's there. I had a good experience. I had psilocybin, and which is fine, but I saw this sort of image and so on. But to understand that it's behind it all is this, something coming through, something pushing it I feel, for its own realization, as a conclusion that Jung actually came to when he said we're basically the vehicles through which the gods move. In his essay called Answer to Job, it's about, that God has to actually, or whatever it is, has to manifest through us. But I feel that maturity, comes when you keep on, you said letting go and so on, but I think that my better word for that is when you consent to letting it take you. It listens. There's no doubt that it listens. I often say to people, well, I'll consent. They say, yeah, but you can make it subject to conditions. You could say, okay, I consent, but please don't give me cancer. Or I consent, but, don't get me in a car accident, or whatever. But you can have a dialogue with that, whatever it is. But still, it's the process of consenting, which I think is makes it a sign of maturity.
Do you connect this mystery, consent, acceptance with maybe getting more comfortable with ambiguity, uncertainty, not knowing, things like that?
Absolutely. And that's well expressed. Yeah, absolutely. Just, just accepting of these things. You don't like all the things that happen to you, believe me, but nevertheless, just accepting that you can't figure out what's going on. You just let go. It was in the book of Job, the very last line, when just before Job, or just after Job says to God, why are you doing this to me? Why have you tortured me and destroyed me? And God answers, but not his question, and says, look, I've created the heavens and I've created the everything. And Job's final line says, I'm comforted that I am dust. He's comforted by the idea that he's, first of all, been addressed by God, but also that he's dust, that he's just another person passing through on the way to possibly, it doesn't look like it, on the way to possibly increasing the consciousness of humanity, or through the experiment that's humanity. Somebody once said, well, if that's the case, how come all these things are going wrong? And, why do we have this violence, terror? And, if you look at it that way, it's sort of like God, or a mystery, whatever it is, experimenting how to actually get humanity to sort of increase its consciousness. Let's try this out. Okay, well, it didn't work. How about we'll try that one out, and so on. So I think that you're totally right in your way. You have to get comfortable with ambiguity, with not knowing, accepting, looking at the James Webb pictures and going, I have no idea what's going on. That's the healthy attitude towards it, I believe.
Do you think there's obviously you've worked with many people over the decades. Is there a good entry point, a starting point into, some of this stuff? And again, maybe that's not a fair question because it all depends on the situation and we're all so different and things like that. But even say this the self, the shadow, things like that, acceptance. How do you think about maybe an on-ramp?
I think there are probably a million on-ramps.
Yeah.
There's
Nice.
no one on-ramp. Every
Yeah.
one of your podcasts is an on-ramp, you know. And I think really, if the process, it doesn't mean you have to go the Jungian way and sort of, go see an analyst, nor do you have to sort of sit for 40 years and meditate, or nor do you have to travel to anywhere in particular. But I think the idea of saying, okay, well, I'm interested in this mystery.
Mm,
Just please take me where I need to go.
mm,
But never at any point saying, okay, I got it now. Oh, phew, that's what it is. Or making ridiculous statements like, I want to be enlightened. Or enlightened to
mm,
me is like Ramana Maharshi, who was so enlightened that bugs were eating a sore on his leg and he didn't, pay attention to his body. I mean, I've been everywhere in India visiting sadhus and monks and into the Himalayas and so on. I finally stopped going up and seeing them when I came across somebody who was in the building next to me in the Bronx. And he was sitting there in the middle of the Himalayas in a cave with me, waiting for some mud to come out. And we thought, let's go. Let's get out of here, We need to go back. We actually went to Calcutta and Intercontinental Hotel and had a hamburger each. So just to ground us back. I just think you just consent and they'll take you. Just say, yes, I want that journey, but I want it with some limitations. But I want that journey. Would you please take?
mm,
And I think you definitely will be answered.
mm. That message you received of call off the search.
Hmm.
Um, I'm curious. And I was thinking of this, um, thing that's come up on the podcast before from the Bhagavad Gita. This idea of
Correct.
letting go of the fruits, if you will. Embarking on a search for its own sake. How do we know if say someone is coming to you or anyone listening? You know, how do we differentiate maybe a search from striving or grasping, terms that might come up in wisdom traditions?
I don't think you actually can. When I've been spent so much time in India, and there were a group of people sort of meditating. But the moment they were finished meditating, they were sort of uh, getting involved in all sorts of different nefarious activities. And you began to think that it'll take you anywhere. You don't know where it's going to go. If you say, even if you believe like 1% in the fact that there's a mystery of things, and you say to that 1%, okay, come on, let's get going on this trip. Let's take me somewhere. Then actually stopping at any point and saying, well, that's it. I can get off the train now. I figured it out. Is a mistake. And actually saying, well, now I understand it all. That's a mistake. But just continuing along from the moment that you start that trip to the very end, and the mystery of death as well. So sometimes it's important to call off the mental search of trying to sort of read more books, become a Buddhist, become a, whatever, join a group. I've done all that. Join a cult and sort of, travels to the Himalayas or Himalayas, as they're called, or go to Bodh Gaya, or sort of go on a retreat. And it's fine. That's all fine. But it's manifesting something. Something's trying to come forward. So not concluding your previous question is, I think, the only way to sort of stop a particular search. There I was just in a loincloth in the middle of 50 million other people. Of course, it's obvious. Call off the search. What are you doing? You're a kid from the Bronx to home, what are you looking for here? What can you get? I always relate that joke to others who talk about this, about the man on his hands and knees under a street light. And somebody comes along and says, "What are you doing?" He said, I lost my keys." He said, "Well, where'd you lose it?" He said, I lost them back over there, but there's light over here. So looking in the wrong place, we all look in the wrong place. So therefore, for me, the only answer is to just let go, just consent. Let it see where it takes you. If it takes you to meditate and takes you to go to a retreat, fine. But calling off the search means stopping looking for a particular thing which you think you're going to get, because you can't know what that possibly could be.
I'm curious to ask, I think maybe a reoccurring question that comes up is, what might be some common obstacles? So if you think of the project of becoming whole, what are a couple, common obstacles that might come up?
Well, I think the the biggest obstacle, I'm talking about people that don't have developmental issues here, who aren't so suffering in a way with illnesses and eating disorders and things like that. But we're talking psychologically. What are the psychological barriers? And again, leaving aside sort of, ancestral views of whether or not you're any good, or whether or not you should be guilty, and so on. I think the biggest problem is inflation of the ego. What actually happens is, let's say you go along somewhere and you go to a retreat and you meditate for 10 days, like a Vipassana retreat or something, and you come out and you're really chilled, and everybody says, "Oh, you've changed, you're really, you're much quieter than you normally are, and you seem sort of more peaceful." And you say to yourself, "Yeah, I've really changed, I've sort of," and you start inflating that aspect of yourself, I really know what I'm doing now. Oh, that person's a guru. I'm going to go with that person because I somehow understand that person's enlightened. So I'm going to follow that. But you have no idea what you're doing. You're just sort of trying to get that kind of inflate yourself. So I think that's the most difficult aspect of the so-called path. But again, as I see it, that's what happens. You've got to, that's what you needed to learn. You needed to try and become a guru in your own right. It's an interesting thing. And some of the various gurus that I've wise people that I've visited in India over many years, I look to see where might they be now. And they all seem to have websites with donation buttons now. And I thought, okay, well, that's where that went. Or you see YouTube sort of gurus who've, without mentioning names, who sort of have very clear, legitimate teachings, but nevertheless become godlike. Or they become the wise people who know everything. They might know, I accept, more than I would, or they might be much more advanced down the path, but they turn themselves into an inflated figure. And we see that with so many problems with, well-known Jungian Trungpa and others who've, Sai Baba and people, I don't know if it's true or not, but have been accused of sort of abusing their power. But all of that just part of the whole experiment, of the whole thing. But one should be aware that that's the moment you get inflated and know, rather than just saying, "I've got no idea," then I'm just going along this way, and it's taking me, and I feel that in me, and I can see that in my dreams. But the moment you actually conclude and think, well, that's the answer, I know what I'm doing, I'm going to be enlightened. I'm going to be whatever. Then you're going to, wind up in a sort of dead end for a while before you can figure that out and get back out. But can't stop it in many ways. Again, that's part of the whole path.
Is that what you mean when you said we need an ego? Like we need the ego to sign up for the 10-day retreat, if you will?
Well, I think we do. Yeah, we need a strong ego. We also need to make a living. We need to sort of, be in the world. But we need a strong ego because, especially if we're, now with the popularity of psychedelics, we need to have a strong ego to be able to reflect on what's going on after we take one of those journeys. Or if, in fact, you have a mystical experience, you need to sort of be able to have strong enough ego to be able to talk about what happened and to be able to incorporate it in the process of individuation. So yeah, you need a strong ego. And therapy is often really useful for that. Get rid of all those sounds in your head. I'm no good. I'm not going to make it. I've got problems. I'm never going to understand things.
I'm always fascinated in the way of maybe it connects with this acceptance, piece that we were talking about in the way of a shadow. This is primarily a philosophy podcast, and something that has come up on numerous episodes is maybe philosophical journaling, where we're essentially looking back at the day. How do we accept maybe where we weren't as virtuous as we could have been, where that can be such a difficult thing. I think many people are maybe familiar with a popular quote that you see on social media from Jung as to, basically accepting the dark side as well to be whole. Why is that so challenging? And how would you maybe work with someone to maybe be more open to accepting maybe just, shortcomings, dark side, whatever, however you might say it?
Well, one thing which is it's pretty clear that you don't want to take someone, yourself or even myself, and say, okay, get down there into the darkness, go really down to the darkness. Any attempt to try and do that is fraught with danger because in our consciousness, it's 50% good, but it's 50% evil as well. It's darkness in there. So people can have accidents and hurt themselves and so on. The idea is to actually begin to develop, this is as far as I'm concerned as a psychoanalyst, to develop a relationship with that unconscious. And in other words, what's coming up in you is purposeful. It's actually there to teach you. It's not there to sort of destroy you or harm you. And as that relationship develops by dreams and so on, then the idea of something darker coming up, which it will, and it sort of titrates itself. It comes up as needed. However that works, no one knows. But it comes up, and then there's some aspect, as I gave you before, about tricky figure I had in my dream. Well, yeah, that sort of introduces me to the fact that, yeah, there are other things in there, but it's purposeful. It's for my benefit that it's come up. I need to face that to become more whole. So I think it has to be, you can't do a deep dive into that darkness. Sometimes people come to me, they've had ayahuasca experience or whatever, and they come up with monsters and horrible things. People have had psychotic breaks for all sorts of reasons of going too far, too deep. Again, I'm not talking about people who have real trauma that they have to deal with. I'm talking about, or PTSD. I'm talking about someone who wants to open up to to that darkness. I think once again, you just have to do it slowly and carefully. under no circumstance, hold your nose and dive in, because it can swallow you whole. So people come and say, well, there was walking down the street, but in the dream there was a figure behind me. It was sort of following me. It was sort of a man. And I'd say, well, what does that man remind you of? He said, well, somebody I met long ago. And you begin to see where the source of that darkness came up and what that person was like and the quality of it. So in answer to your question, I think you have to once again consent to the process, but again, put boundaries on it. Just don't say, give me everything you got, which I'm not saying. But I'm interested in exploring that. You have to have faith. If you have faith in the existence, and faith is the wrong word, if you have a belief from experience in the existence of something working through you, then you can begin to trust that it's all going to go your way. Things will come good. And when you reach darkness, it's there as a lesson. But I caution anybody about trying to just figure it all out by jumping into, say, okay, bring on all the stuff at once. It's no good.
What about someone who is, maybe they're sitting down at the end of the day and, they have a blank page and they're practicing, this art of journaling or something, and they become aware of psychological projection. You mentioned projection early in the conversation, and maybe you could say more about that. How would one, I guess then what would be my question?
Well, the idea of projection is that you're projecting out an aspect of yourself which you don't want to actually face. So I might sort of walk on the street, see someone coming towards me and go, oh, God, that guy's hopeless, I could tell he's really nasty. Well, how would I know that? I wouldn't know, except that I'm projecting out my own fears, my own worries, which everybody has. There's nobody less here beyond anything of a sort of rational nature. Everybody's going to project out. And we have that all the time. Or we see a younger person who we're attracted to. All of a sudden, that would be another aspect, such as a feeling aspect, which you might not have if you're totally an intellectual. You might need to, and these things shock you. Why would I be so, attracted to that person? Look how their skin is smooth, and all that. And just projecting out, which is not available to them at the time, the sort of idea of their own softness or their own feeling or their own refinement and so on. So that's the nature of projection. And we use that psychoanalysis all the time, psychology as well, to just say, well, hey, wait a minute, what's that about? Why is that person who you haven't seen in 20 years in your dream? What was that person like? Well, the person was really boring, and also was, I think, trying to betray me. And then you go, okay, well, let's talk about that person. In fact, what I often do is spend a lot of time talking about what that person was really like and actually getting them to virtually appear in the room and say, well, what's that? What would that person say to you? What are they doing here? Why are they in your dream? So that's the nature of projection. And I think the most difficult part of being a psychoanalyst is what's called projective identification, which is where somebody will project something onto you, like the person you're seeing, the client, and you're not aware of the fact that you actually have a weakness there. and that you have an issue there. So all of a sudden they're putting onto you these things about, about sickness, and all of a sudden you start feeling really ill. Now you don't know why. And that's because they're trying to turn you into something, but you haven't worked through that issue yourself as an analyst. That's why psychoanalysts, as opposed to psychologists, must have a very long psychoanalysis themselves to try and be aware of their parts, which aren't going to jump out at them and cause them to break the proper relationship between them and the patient. So projection is very powerful, very powerful.
How about this idea of the importance of opposites? You talk about in the book, I made a note here, the strengthening of the self occurs by an ongoing process of the reconciliation of the opposites that are brought forth from the unconscious.
Yes, well, this was very much, it's not just Jung, it's Hegel, and it's, historically the idea. It exists actually in everything, in Sufism in particular, in every mystical tradition, the idea that there are things which can push and pull you in different ways. Spirit and matter, good and evil is an easy one to work. So you have aspects which are, good. You really want to help someone, but then you also have conflict about it because you think that's sort of ripping you off. The idea is that you have to find a way to deal with both of them and hold them both, to be able to see both sides of them at any one time with a particular issue. And when you do that, as another thing arises, a way to sort of bridge the two. A third thing comes up, not just the two opposites, a third thing. And that's the basis of the self. The self is meant to hold those opposites. It stands in the middle. It is the thing which actually mediates between the two. So if you have those issues, but then you can step back from it and say, well, that both of them are fine, then that strengthens the self. That strengthens that quality which actually seeks to center you at all times. You're not pulled one way and you're not pulled the other way. That's a snapshot of that idea, the coincidence of opposites. They're always operating.
How do you make sense of maybe us as a society still having a tough time with this thing of opposites? Maybe you could say it's a very ancient idea that shows up across wisdom traditions, but it seems to be such a difficult thing for us to hold.
Well, I personally look at it this way. I'm very influenced by a man called Sri Aurobindo, who was educated in England, who was Indian, educated in England, went to Calcutta was a professor there. And he then went down to what was then called Pondicherry, and around him formed this ashram. And he was, to me, the wisest of all people. And he said that our species is not enough to contain that self. We can't hold it. It's too big. It's in the Kabbalistic idea of the shards, the idea that we can't hold everything. It breaks into parts. We're not capable of doing it. Aurobindo's idea was that there needs to be evolution. I mean, we're not the species that can do it. We just can't settle all this. It's just too great. There's be wars and conflict and smallness, backbiting and hatreds, and we can't solve it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And in the process of trying, something new might happen. And there needs to be an evolution. And, it might take 1,000 years, might take 10,000 years. Something else has to emerge. And that's how I see it personally. That gives me comfort. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But it gives me a lot of comfort that it's going to happen eventually. But in the meantime, like with you, I wince at all that news and the latest thing of indictment in Russia and all that. I try not to even watch it. It's just so disturbing. But I only have hope that these things will be resolved as we go. How else could I not, as a father and grandfather, sort of have these views?
Yeah. Well, beautiful. I'm so grateful for your time, Les. This is really flown by. We have this final wrap-up question that we ask everybody. How do you define or think about wisdom in daily life? And maybe we've been talking about that for the last 50 minutes or so.
No.
But I'm curious to maybe add one thing to that in the way of this project of the self, individuation, some of these things we talk about to connect, does it connect with love? Is becoming whole, becoming wiser, in turn lead to us becoming more loving and compassionate with one another? So yeah, just as a way to wrap it up, I'll put it to you.
Well, before answering the question directly, I mean, there's no doubt that that the loving is a manifestation of having worked through your shadow a bit. The capacity to get out of your own way allows you to be accordingly more loving. You might make mistakes, will make mistakes, but nevertheless, the capacity for, especially for a modern intellectual person, which we all are, is to actually soften and let go and realize that we're all these things, good and bad. And from that comes the capacity to really love, not love in the abstract. I always think of the metta, the loving kindness in Buddhism, being able to not just love yourself, but everybody around you and them like that. And some of it has to be manifested in service. So I'm very keen, unlike perhaps some of my colleagues, and you have to work in the community as well. You can't just sit there in a little solipsistic bubble and sort of just get enlightened. You have to actually be there as part of, otherwise you can't love. But in terms of the question, what is wisdom? The only thing I can say is that the key to that, as best as I've observed, is just the constant process of reminding yourself that you consent. You consent to the process. You consent to the mystery taking you where you need to go. Sometimes things are insurmountable. You have a terrible pain, or you're sick, or something like that. You can't do that. But when you can do it, you'll be able to say, okay, I consent with limitations, but I want it to take me. I want it to keep on opening. And that's the only wisdom that you need. The answers are those which are not verbal or articulated. The answers will come by the sort of closer connection with that mystery, which is unable to be expressed. So it's not a set thing. Wisdom is X. Wisdom is just opening. To be wise enough to say, yeah, I'm just going to open.
Well, beautiful. This has been great, Les. Again, I'm super grateful. Your book is Becoming Whole: Jung's Equation for Realizing God, and I see you've got some newer books and maybe some that are coming out soon. Is there anything that you might want to mention to the listeners?
Well, one thing which I'm really fascinated about is that in December we've organized a conference called Psychedelics and Individuation, Conversations with Jungian Analysts, which is based on a book that I'm editing along with a colleague in California called Psychedelics and Individuation, essays by Jungian Analysts, where there are 12 people who, some, for instance, one person in the Netherlands using microdosing therapy, another person's involved with the Andes people and been using, understanding the whole process of ayahuasca and what's actually happening, so on. So that conference comes up in December. It's going to be at Pacifica Graduate Institute in California. And it's online as well. So that's a book that's going to come out. And I feel that's going to open up a new dimension.
Mm.
There's going to be a new dimension, I think, because these experiences will sort of keep on alerting people to the fact that there's something they don't know. There's something new that's going to happen. And so I feel that's a sort of new starting point. Everybody's very nervous in the psychoanalytic community because how do we take all this learning that we've had and say, okay, well, where does that fit in now? It's like, how do we deal with it? How can do we help, or do we just talk about it, and so on? So that would be the thing that's forthcoming for me at the moment.
Nice. Well, looking forward to that, and I appreciate you sharing it. We'll put links to all sorts of stuff in the show notes so it's easy to find for the listeners. So Les Stein, thank you so much for coming on In Search of Wisdom.
Thanks, Josh. I enjoyed it.